Imagine you're walking through the marketplace. You're a respected general, a celebrated poet, a powerful politician. You've built your reputation over decades. People admire you. Then a short, barefoot man walks up and asks you a simple question. Within 10 minutes, you can't answer it. Not because it's complicated, because it's simple. And you realize, for the first time, that you've been living your entire life on assumptions you never examined. You've been calling yourself wise without ever checking if that was actually true. That man was Socrates. He did this to everyone, every single day, for decades. He was so effective at exposing the gap between what people believed and what they actually knew that the most powerful city in the ancient world eventually decided the only way to stop him was to kill him. So they did. And instead of silencing him, they made him immortal. Today we're talking about why Socrates questioned everything, and why that same habit might be the most dangerous and necessary thing you can develop in the world we're living in right now. Socrates was born around 470 BC in Athens, son of a stonemason. Not nobility, not wealth, no political connections. He spent most of his adult life not working, wandering the streets of Athens, stopping people and asking them questions. He wrote nothing down. Everything we know comes from his students, primarily Plato, which means we're always seeing him through someone else's eyes. But the picture that emerges is one of the most distinctive human beings who ever lived. He was famously ugly. Flat nose, bulging eyes, stocky frame. He dressed poorly, wore no shoes regardless of weather, and cared almost nothing about social status. He survived on almost no money and claimed to need almost nothing. And yet he was magnetic. The brightest young minds in Athens followed him, not because he promised them anything, but because conversations with Socrates did something no other conversation could. They cracked open your mind and showed you something uncomfortable and impossible to unsee. He once said he was like a gadfly, the biting insect that lands on a lazy horse and forces it to move. Athens was the horse. He was the gadfly. He took that job seriously until the day they made him drink poison for it. What exactly did Socrates do? The method he developed, called the Socratic method, is almost embarrassingly simple in concept, and one of the most powerful intellectual tools ever created in practice. He would approach someone who claimed expertise in a particular area, a general who claimed to understand courage, a politician who claimed to understand justice, a poet who claimed to understand beauty. And he'd ask them to define it. Just define it. You've built your life around this concept. Explain it to me. Then he'd listen. And when they answered, he wouldn't argue directly. He'd ask a single careful follow-up question, and then another. Not to win, not to humiliate, but to genuinely test whether the idea held up. Almost every time it didn't. The person who had confidently declared themselves an expert found themselves tangled in contradictions they'd never noticed, collapsing under the gentlest examination. What made this unsettling was that Socrates wasn't bringing a better answer, just better questions. He famously claimed to know nothing, that the only thing he truly understood was the depth of his own ignorance. He wasn't performing modesty, he meant it. This is where the famous story comes from. The oracle at Delphi declared Socrates the wisest man in Athens. Confused, he went looking for someone wiser than himself. He couldn't find one. Not because everyone was ignorant, but because everyone else thought they knew things they didn't actually know. Socrates at least knew that he didn't know. And that, he concluded, was the beginning of wisdom. The Socratic method was profoundly threatening, not to humble people, but to anyone whose power depended on the assumption that they already had the answers. Think about what it feels like to be publicly shown that the thing you've built your reputation on the thing you've been confidently teaching others, the thing justifying your authority, is something you can't actually define or defend. It's not an intellectual experience, it's a personal one. It feels like exposure. And over decades, that feeling accumulated into something dangerous. The politicians, generals, and professional persuaders who built careers on sounding wise without necessarily being wise. They all had reason to want Socrates silenced. In 399 BC, they got their chance. He was put on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety. Vague charges, widely understood to be political. He was 70 years old. At his trial, Socrates did something extraordinary. He didn't apologize. He didn't promise to stop. He stood before the jury and said, "You can kill me, but you cannot make me stop." To stop questioning would be to stop living in the only way that matters. The jury voted to execute him. He accepted it calmly, told his friends not to grieve, and drank the hemlock. He died because he wouldn't stop asking questions, and made his life the most powerful argument he ever crafted. Here's what people miss. Every question Socrates asked pointed at the same problem. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for self-deception. We're good at believing we understand things we don't, at feeling certain when we shouldn't, at living on inherited assumptions without checking if they're true. The cost isn't just intellectual, it's moral. When those deciding justice don't know what justice is, you get unjust outcomes with confidence. When leaders lack virtue, self-interest gets dressed as public service. Socrates believed this wasn't optional. It was the basic moral obligation of a thinking person. The unexamined life is not worth living, and he meant it literally. Not as provocation, as conviction. A life built on unexamined beliefs is a life built on someone else's foundations, someone else's values, someone else's definition of what matters. We live in a world with more information than ever, and more unexamined certainty. The internet doesn't reward nuance, it rewards confidence, the performance of knowing. Socrates would have been fascinated and horrified, because confidence and knowledge are not the same thing. The most dangerous person isn't the one who knows little. It's the one who knows little but believes completely, who has never entertained being wrong. The Socratic habit, questioning assumptions before they harden into convictions, asking what you mean before you defend it, treating your certainty with skepticism you'd apply to someone you disagree with, doesn't come naturally. It has to be deliberately developed, defended against the pressure to stop thinking. But it's worth it. Not because it makes you smarter, because it makes you honest. Socrates questioned for 40 years, wrote nothing down, charged no tuition, held no office. By every conventional measure, he was nobody. And yet here we are, 2,500 years later, still using his method, still grappling with his questions, still trying to live up to the standard he set. The unexamined life is not worth living. You don't have to agree with everything he believed. You just have to be willing to ask, genuinely, whether what you're most certain about holds up under scrutiny. If it does, you'll be stronger. If it doesn't, you needed to know. Drop a comment. What's one belief you've never really examined? If this is the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe. New video dropping soon.